Hi, I'm David Kong, and welcome to this video on super low budget filmmaking. I'm going to be talking a lot about the techniques and the principles that you use to get a very high quality, polished look with minimal equipment. And I'm also going to be talking about a film that I shot called Portrait of Macerata as a sort of test case. It's a film that I shot while I was traveling in Italy. It's a beautiful hill town I was staying in, and I just made this video showcasing the beauty of this town. And since I was traveling and I wasn't really there to be filmmaking, I had very little equipment with me. So this will be a perfect example of how you can use a very small amount of equipment, literally 2 bags. This is my shoulder bag and my tripod bag, to get a very high budget look. So if you haven't checked it out yet, it'll be posted right below here. When you've seen it, come back here and I'll show you how I made that film. All the stuff that I brought with me to Italy adds up to about $1,000. And in terms of video gear, that's not really very much at all. All right, let's take a look at the gear that I did bring. And it all fit into this little shoulder bag and this tripod bag. Quite small as well. It says Manfrotto, but it's not actually a Manfrotto tripod. I just had that bag and I used it because it was very small. So the camera that I brought was the Canon T2i, also known as the 550D. It's a great little camera. It's very small, one of the reasons why I like it. And it's very cheap. You can, since it's a few versions old, the T2i, you can get this, I saw it refurbished for $350 with a lens the other day, which is crazy cheap for an actual DSLR that can make a great image. I used the kit lens, comes with it, 18-55, extremely small and light. And it has actually quite a fantastic image, especially considering the price and the size. You know, I have an 18-50 that's 2.8 all the way through, but it's at least 2.5 times as big and 2.5 times as heavy, and I couldn't take that. But this did a fantastic job. I also have Magic Lantern installed on here, which I highly recommend. I'll be going into Magic Lantern a lot later because Magic Lantern is what really turns this little DSLR into something that can double for a camcorder. It can give you a whole bunch of great features, which you will see later as I get into the technical side of this. Apart from that, I have this little box which houses my motor for my slider. This is something I put together myself. There's a little servo controller and battery, and this keeps it safe. This cost about 60 bucks all told, and I will get into a lot more detail with that later. And then we have some padding, which is great, so you don't smash up your gear. And the Canon 50mm f1.4. This is a fantastic lens. Though, to be honest, I only use this at 1.4 and maybe a couple of shots in the movie. F1.4 is great, but it's so shallow sometimes that it can just be too shallow, and you just can't really make out what's going on in the shot. So a lot of the time I was shooting this at even the shots that look really shallow are often at 1.8 or 2 or something like that. So I could have easily gotten away with the f1.8 version of this, which is even smaller and lighter. Would have brought it had I had one. And that one only costs $110. This one is about $250 if you grab it on sale, like I did. Apart from that, all we got is a brush to get dust off the lens, and a little lens cloth. Came with the camera for free, and then a little case with 2 filters in it. First one is a circular polarizer, which was very valuable to me in this film because I knew I was going to have to worry about fighting against the fairly limited dynamic range and codec that I was shooting in. And the circular polarizer is great for taking down highlights if you've got like a bright reflection, and it's also good for taking down the sky if you have a very bright sky. This is going to come in very handy. I will get into more of that later. The other filter I took was, oh, by the way, that was a Tiffin, that polarizer. It was 18 bucks, and it did a great job. I didn't have problems with flare or vignetting or anything like that. The other filter is a Tiffin also, ND filter. It's an ND 0.9, which is 8 stops. So it darkens the image a lot. This one is Tiffin also, and it was 12 bucks, which is crazy. I have a much more expensive and much nicer fader ND filter, which, to be honest, there were some times when I wished I had had it with me, but it's much bigger and I would have to worry about stepper rings, things like that. The advantage of these two 58mm smaller filters is that they both fit straight onto my two lenses without having to worry about adapters. That was very handy. I use the neutral density filter mainly with the 50mm 1.4 because there are times when if you're shooting wide open or even at 1.8 or 2 and you're in full sunlight, so you're shooting a shot of a city street in full bright sunlight, the camera's not even going to be able to expose because there's so much light coming through the lens that even at ISO 100, you're going to have to turn the shutter speed, even like at 4,000th, 1/4000th of a second, sometimes I couldn't expose. And I also didn't want to have to go to 1/4000th of a second all the time because it gives you a very choppy look if you've got much motion. So I kept the ND filter on the lens when it was wide open a lot of the time. And that's everything in the shoulder bag except for a water bottle because it was very hot. I was walking around a lot on my feet in the very hot weather. Apart from that, I have a tripod. This is a Velbone tripod. You can't actually buy this exact model anymore, but it was $129 and it's a photo tripod. It's not meant to be a video tripod. It's much too thin and wobbly to be a solid video tripod, but I couldn't take my solid video tripod, so took the photo tripod and did my best. And I put a Velbone also. This is the PH369 head. It's very light and very cheap. It's $35 for this head, and it's a quite smooth fluid head. It won't handle a huge camera, but I wasn't using a huge camera, so it didn't bother me. And the only thing left is my slider. This is made by Igus. It's pretty much the cheapest slider money can buy. I bought the slider plus carriage I think it was $90 on Amazon. And one of the reasons why I bought this was because I knew I wanted something very small. And this actually came at 1 meter, so it was about here. And I literally just chopped it in half with a hacksaw because I knew I needed something very small to fit in this small tripod bag that I was carrying around with me. And obviously if I had if I had taken a nice, fancy, all the bells and whistles slider, I wouldn't have been able to chop it off like that. So this did, and it's also quite light. So that's it. That's all my gear. The real point that I want to make with this video is that you don't need to have a lot of fancy, expensive equipment to make a movie. That stuff is great. A Steadicam is a great tool. I love my Steadicam. But my point is, not having a Steadicam is no excuse not to make a film. Not having a crane, not having, I don't know, a C300 is no excuse not to go out and make movies. Because if you're creative and you get to learn your gear, you learn how it works, you learn what its limitations are, you can work with it and you can make something beautiful. Would I rather have a Red? Sure. But I was traveling in Italy. I was really planning on just doing photography on this trip. I wasn't even planning on doing a film, but I found myself in this town and I wanted to make a movie, so I said, okay, what do I have? What can I do with what I have? There are two important ways of thinking about the way you plan your shots. One of them, like I just said, is thinking in terms of limitation. Thinking, okay, here's what I have. How can I use what I have to its best advantage? Rather than looking at the scene and imagining the best shot you could shoot of the scene, think, what is my tool best used with, or how is it best used? And now how can I apply that to the scene? The other is, of course, how can I use my gear in more than one way? The obvious choice for that principle in this film is my slider, which, if you notice, there are actually a couple shots where it looks like I have a crane there, but I don't. I have a slider. And what I do is I mount the slider on my tripod head, turn it like this, and I use this mini tripod, this thing, tiny, tiny little tripod, to mount my camera on. And then if you put the slider at, I don't know, this much or even this much of an angle, the shot looks like a crane shot. And I use that twice in this film. And I had to shoot both of those shots backwards, actually, because my motor wasn't powerful enough to pull my carriage, so I had to actually do it by hand. And when I tried to go uphill, I was supporting the weight of the camera up. I just shook the tripod all over the place because it's a very flimsy, light tripod. So what I ended up doing is shooting both of those shots backwards going down, and I played them in reverse to make it look like I was craning up. Of course, that limits me because I can't have any people on the scene moving around. I can't have any birds or anything like that. And I definitely would have liked to have had a real crane and be able to go up and down as I pleased. But I was able to think, okay, here's what I've got. I've got to find a shot where I can get a crane shot without any movement. And I found two perfectly great shots, thinking in terms of that. The other thing to think about with the slider is, of course, this is a very small slider. The actual travel distance I have on here is 14 inches. From here to here is 14. From there to there, which is quite small for a slider. So I had to think, okay, I've got this short slider, but I want to make a nice video. I want to make it look like I've got more than just 14 inches of travel on my slider. The way to do that is, well, there are two ways. One is open the lens up all the way. When I say that, I mean zoom out all the way, wide lens, and put things in the foreground. Like, one way to do that, of course, is to put the slider on the ground, so you see the ground in the foreground. Or just have a, I don't know, a railing, a branch of a tree, a column, or something like that in the foreground. And you can move very slowly, but since the thing is so close to you, the amount that the object moves in the frame is fairly large, even though the distance of travel of the camera is quite small. So there are a few shots. There's one where I come out from behind a column into this sort of colonnade area, and you didn't even see the full length of that shot. The length of that shot was from about here to here, but it seems to have quite a long distance of travel because I'm so close. The pillar, like the front of my lens was here, the pillar was a few inches in front of me. And there was also a shot, in fact, one of the crane shots was I was coming up over a pew in a church, and I had it so my camera lens was almost touching the edge of the pew in front of me. And so it seems like I come out this big movement from behind the pew, when in fact I only moved a few inches to get that kind of travel. The other way to get the most out of a very short slider is to find a scene with a lot of parallax, which means there are a lot of different objects at different distances from you. They're not all on the same plane relative to you. And when you move the slider, even if it's going a very short distance, if you're zoomed all the way in instead of zoomed out, a lot of parallax will give the illusion that the camera is moving farther than it actually is. So those are a few examples of the ways in which you have to really think, okay, not just what cool shots can I get, but how can I use what I have to its best advantage? Sometimes when you're working with very limited equipment, you have to stretch and try to, adapt things to make them look better than they are, like with the slider I was just talking about. But also sometimes you just have to sort of accept that there's going to be a limitation in the way that you're shooting and roll with it. For instance, with my focus with this film, I didn't have a follow focus, and I was working with a tripod that was very wobbly because it's really a photo tripod. It's not meant to be sturdy and have people bumping it around, which meant it was really hard to do a rack focus shot. There are 2 rack focuses in this film, but they were both a huge pain, and I had to take a bunch of takes before I got one that wasn't bumpy. So I just had to sort of think, okay, well, I'm just not going to have a lot of rack focuses in this film. And then I started thinking about that, and I realized, that may not be a bad thing. Rack focuses can sort of draw attention to the filmmaker, the camera, the lens, and that can pull attention away from the actual subject of your film. And since I had almost no rack focuses in this film, it sort of distanced my presence as the filmmaker from what you get as the audience get to see. When there's a lot of crazy rack focusing, it can really draw your attention to the focus, and you start thinking about what the focus is. Whereas if you just let it sit where it is, it can be a little bit more natural. Of course, this is very subjective, I know, but this is an example of just how you can say, okay, I'm stuck with this, but maybe I can work this into the way that I shoot and make it deliberate, or however you want to call that. When I was thinking about how I could use my lenses creatively, one of the things that I wanted to do was try to make it look like I had more lenses and I had more flexibility than I actually did. So I sort of used both of these lenses sort of at their max quite a lot. And in terms of zoom, I use the kit lens at 18 a good bit, which is as wide as it can go. And then I also use it at 55 a good bit. In fact, I was often going from 18 to 55 or 18 or back. I did shoot some in the middle, but very often I was doing that because it sort of gives me more variety in the kinds of shots that I can use, or gives me quite a lot of variety in the kinds of shots that I can use. And you know, sometimes it can be frustrating not having a long lens, for instance. I didn't have a long lens at all. But as the old photographers always used to say, you zoom with your feet. If you're using a prime lens and you want to be closer in, you just walk closer in. Or if you want to be wider, you walk further back. And I did a lot of that. I did a lot of zooming with my feet with this film. But the advantage of all this gear was that it was so light that it wasn't really an issue having to pick up the tripod and move it all the time. The tripod, it's tiny. I can lift it with one finger. It's not an issue to move it around a lot. So I was cursed, but I was also blessed with the lack of big equipment that I was working with. So here's the tripod motor slider setup that I use. And the way I was able to get smooth shots with this very flimsy setup was entirely because of this motor. This tripod is not meant to hold this much weight. And if I just bump this, I'm not sure if you can tell in the video, but if I bump this, the camera is going to wobble a little bit. And if I bump it this way or this way, it's going to wobble. So operating this by hand without wobbling is actually really hard. It's quite a pain. Now, the way I managed to get clear shots, or smooth shots, was with the way the motor works. So it's not actually a motor, it's a servo, I should say. Servo is attached. I'll show you inside here in a second. Servo is attached at the end of this slider, and it's pulling with a little piece of fishing line. It's just like 25-pound test fishing line. And it's pulling this way. The tension, when the servo engages, is lateral along this rail, which is very firm in that way. It's a little bit bendy this way, but it's not bendy at all this way. It doesn't compress itself. So when I put tension from this end to this end, it's completely firm and it holds steady without wobbling at all. So as long as I can control my slider with the servo, I have no problems, no matter how light my tripod is. So I'll just give you a quick overview. So just a little battery pack with 4 AA's in there. This is my controller. It's just a little knob. And inside there, I'll tip this forward for you, is my servo. And it's just a little servo that hobbyists use for model robots or things like that. And the servo cost about 20 bucks. And altogether, this whole little setup here was only about 60. Now, I've actually upgraded a little bit since I shot the Italy film, but this is the setup as it was when I was shooting. So I'll just give you a quick demo. What happens is the servo spins around and winds up this coil of fishing line. So I can go really slowly, even slower than that if I want to, or very fast. And that's how it works. Now, of course, it's not a belt system, which would have been more convenient, because I can't go both ways. I have to sort of unwind and pull it back manually. But I never, to be honest, I never needed to go one way and then the other way without stopping. The fact that it can only go one way didn't really bother me. And that's the servo. If you guys like, I may do a much more in-depth video on how to actually build this and where to find the parts, but that's a little bit out of the scope of this video I'm in right now. So that's an overview of the way that I approached this project and the way I tried to sort of squeeze the most production value I could out of the limited gear I had with me on this shoot. But I haven't really touched all of the digital technical side of things. There's a lot more to talk about in terms of color space, dynamic range, codecs, Technicolor CineStyle profile, post-production, color correction, all that stuff. But I'm going to cut this video short right here, and I'm going to make a second video addressing all of the digital technical side of things. But I'll give a little bit of time for you guys to post comments, give me feedback. Tell me what you'd like to see covered in a second video. Tell me if there's anything that I went over too quickly in this video that you want to get clarified. Just comment and I'll address that in my next video. Or if you have any particular shots that you wanted you had questions about from the film, if you just want to know, like, how did I get that shot? What was I thinking? Just comment and tell me, give me the timestamp of when that shot occurred, and I will cover it for you. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. My name is David Kong, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you next time.